Those that fear the cold never find secrets beneath the ice. The old proverb always rang true for Tamarys. It felt especially relevant today as a blizzard whipped the snow into a stinging gale. Alpine winds tore at her hair and the fringe of her heavy cloak as she looked down on the steaming lake. Months ago she had met a man on these shores, a man who was unafraid of the cold. He had been sitting on the frozen, rock-strewn ground above the lake, shirtless and eyes closed. Curious and more than a little amused, she approached. When he failed to react, she had cleared her throat and said, "You seem ill-prepared for the weather, stranger." Her breath hung heavy in the thin air. The man opened his eyes, exhaling slowly as he glanced at Tamarys. "Inner fire will withstand any chill. At least that's what the shamans up here taught me. I thought I had the technique down till I was interrupted." The last part was said with a faint grin. Tamarys bowed in mock apology. "Pardon me, I was worried that you would freeze solid." The man shook his head, his hair spilling from its loose knot. "Not yet, at least, and this is my fourth try." "Try?" The man pointed down at Caldera. The howl of dragons mingled with the wail of the winter winds. "Down there, among the dragon eggs, there's a place that holds answers. For me. Like who I really am." He stood and nodded. "I'm Kaleb, by the way." "Tamarys," the mage said, returning the acknowledgement. "That is a weighty question for a man so young." Kaleb laughed, his smile warm. "Heavy enough to sink the bottom of the damn lake, that's for sure." He shrugged, the smile fading. "I was born into mysteries. I didn't see my father often, and he played his cards close to his chest, even when he was able to see me." Kaleb started to stretch, and Tamarys heard joints pop as he changed the topic. "And what brings you to the top of the world?" "Curiosity more than anything." Tamarys gestured at the pack on her back. "I travel, studying magic and history, though the two are often intertwined. I wish to learn from the Genev currently, but I understand they are an isolated lot." "You can say that again," Kaleb grunted, his eyes locked on the icy waters. "I scared some ornery wildlife away from their walls for them, and it still took a week for them to let me in. The Genev elders are an unhurried lot. I learned much from them. Down slope that way, in a hidden valley." Kaleb nodded to the northwest, then without looking at Tamarys said, "Now I only have a few hours of daylight, so you'll have to excuse me," and took off running. Tamarys watched as he leapt off the snowy bank, his body arcing into a dive, and plunged into the steaming waters. The mage blinked. "Well then." She waited on the bank for an hour. Kaleb never surfaced. Months later, after following a friendly merchant to Argenport, Tamarys learned who the man was, or had been. The Kaleb she heard about in Argenport sounded different. Purposeful, driven, less friendly. What had he found in that lake? The thought kept with her through study with the paladins of the Crown Watch and attending lectures at the Cambrai campuses. What had Kaleb discovered beneath the ice? The summer passed into autumn, and it became clear that the son of Caiaphas would not be denied his shot at the throne. Tamarys could no longer ignore her curiosity. She had to return to the frozen shores of the Caldera. The winds seemed hungrier now, the coming winds sharpening their appetite. Tamarys felt the mountain groan beneath her boots, their roots reaching down deep into the warmth of the earth. "This place is old," she thought, feeling the weight of ages, "but something in that lake isn't." She sensed something modern, a secret sunk in the ice, full of arcane alchemy and shiftstone-powered machinery. You cannot learn from a past that is buried, she thought. Stripping off her gloves, she raised her hands towards the lake, and called on the old stones of the mountain to give up their secret. Glowing runes flared in her hands as the lake rumbled, waves rippling out from the center. Tamarys' arms began to burn with the effort of maintaining the spell. Time to put theory into practice. She gritted her teeth as the spire of the building began to emerge. The waves crashed to the shore, freezing into ramparts of ice and snow, slowly shattering ice as it rose. The tower emerged from the lake. The large stone tower was empty, save for the broken remains of its mechanical caretakers. The rooms inside had been torn apart. The remnants of shattered crystal tanks littered long, cramped hallways. As Tamarys ventured further in, the destruction became worse. Bullet holes and burns scarring the walls. What was the purpose of this place? Alchemy, magic, and technology all combined to an unknown end, hidden in one of the most inhospitable places in the world. Why? More pressingly, who or what had fought down here? The stone walls here speak of pain, Tamarys thought, her lantern casting thin light on the heavy, dripping ceiling, and of desperation. There had been a struggle, a fight between two foes that only one had walked away from, but Tamarys found no bodies, only rusted scrap. Her eyes aching from the dim light and her arms stiff from holding the lantern, Tamarys turned to leave. Just as she pulled up her hood to step back into the storm, the flickers of the guttering oil lamp caught the edge of a design. Tamarys gasped. Carved above the door was a circle subdivided into sections like a stylized wheel or knot, with a gold circle at its center. Chapter 23. Reunion. The room was quiet. Bryn's body lay still, his breathing shallow. The praxis physician straightened up and nodded at Talir. A brush with shadow can warp body or mind, but he seems to have survived the worst of it. We will watch and do what we can. Thank you, Talir murmured, exiting the room. In the hall outside, Eileen sat, holding her crown in one hand, back rigid. Kaleb paced, his armor creaking. "Are you sure?" he asked again. "Of course I'm not sure," Eileen snapped. "None of this makes sense." "It could be," Talir thought. "I glimpsed beyond the edges. Shadows and smoke, a voice in the darkness. What if that really was—" "Archmagister!" A sharp voice rang down the hall. All three figures looked up to see a tall woman walking quickly toward them, her blue cape trailing behind. She did not wait for Talir to acknowledge her, continuing, "Did you see? The wards have been triggered. The omens are clear. Something is moving in the Shadowlands. A great conflict." Eileen looked to her sister-in-law in alarm. Traver? Her newly won city had suffered enough. The return of the strangers might break it completely. "No," Tessia shook her head emphatically. "But power gathers nearby. Where the borders are thin, the waystones are awakening." "The waystones alight?" Talir frowned. "You have seen this place? You know where it is?" "Yes," Tessa confirmed, "but I cannot see the source of the disruption." "Finally," Kaleb muttered, pulling his sawed-off shotgun from its heavy holster. "Whatever it is, let's go give it a warm welcome." The land had started to blend again, the warp and twist easing as Vara felt the Shadowlands recede. She was surprised to find herself more comfortable somehow, assured. Tracking her quarry had given her an instinct for the hidden paths and rough turns. "I hope Roland has learned not to send more bounty hunters," she thought, as she emerged from a deep cut in the earth onto a sunlit rise. A last tendril of shadow curled away, and her boot touched grass for the first time in weeks. "It's been a long walk." As her eyes adjusted to the bright sun, A man's voice bellowed, "There it is!" and a ball of fire roared toward her. Vara's mouth went dry with the sudden heat, but a flick of her wrist sent the fire rebounding back toward its source. Home sweet home. "Hold!" Eileen called. The sound of her mother's voice hit Vara like a torrent of ice water. The tone of command was unmistakable. Mother? Here? Shading her gaze, Vara surveyed her surroundings. Her Aunt Talir stood nearby, arms crossed and aloof. Something's different about her. Her brother Kaleb stood to her left, next to a smoking crater in the ground. His gun was halfway out of its holster, but he made no move to draw. Instead, he was glaring at Eileen, who was clad in armor and blue flight leathers, sword held at her side. Her expression was controlled, and she made no move toward Vara. Clearing her throat, Vara said, "Hello, Mother. This is quite the welcome." Eileen's eyes narrowed. "You sound like her, but apparitions of shadow cannot be trusted." Kaleb nodded, his grip on his firearm tightening. "Oh, please," Vara sighed. "Why do we always have to do this?" "Perhaps you are my daughter," Eileen said, her voice rising. "My daughter who abandoned her throne, the throne our people bled to win, who fled her responsibilities and abandoned her family in a time of need." Winds collected around Eileen, kicking the dirt into furious eddies. "Tell me then, daughter, if you are her, why have you returned?" Kaleb let out a low whistle and slid his gun back into its holster. Vara knew her mother well enough to hear the pain behind her accusations. And she wasn't wrong, but Vara had learned much since then. "Yes, at first I ran," Vara said. The words came out quieter than she intended. "I didn't want that life, your life. But I was also chased away, and led away, and deceived." The scar at the base of Vara's neck, where Zindel's amulet had burned her, prickled with pain. A guide betrayed me, a wanderer who called himself a Zindel. He stole my memories, and more. Eileen's eyes widened and Kaleb frowned, confused. "Interesting and troubling," Talir said, walking towards her niece. "A man known as a Zindel was behind the army that Traver brought to Argenport." Eileen turned to stare at the Archmagister. "You never thought to mention this?" "I survived, though," Var said with a shrug. "A Zindel of the Shadowlands and worse. I've learned much, and I've returned to assume my responsibilities. I must speak with Roland." Silence reigned, underscored only by the wind. Talir finally said, "Roland is dead. Assassinated in his dungeons after being deposed by the Cabal." "Oh," Vara said quietly. "How long have I been gone?" "I wish I could say I was sorry, but..." She shook her head. "What became of the city?" "I retook Argenport," Eileen replied, with a small, fierce smile. "It is safe. Healing, even." "That just leaves us," Kaleb drawled, taking a step towards Vara and Eileen, thumb hooked through his belt, "and the question of who takes the throne." "Question?" Vara asked innocently. "Only one of us is Caiaphas' heir." "I thought you walked away from all that," Kaleb shot back, heat entering his words. Eileen said nothing, but turned to watch her daughter. Kaleb was not her ally, not quite, but the point stood. "I have seen much, brother, and have much to share." Vara's gaze was commanding. "The world is much larger than the clans in Argenport. I have seen what crawls in the depths of shadow. The threat is out there. We need a ruler who can handle those challenges." "Bah! I've got more than Caiaphas in my blood than any of you," Kaleb said, voice rising. "Argenport needs a king with a steady hand, someone who can make alliances and gain the support of the people. Making friends has never been your strongest suit." You have even less political experience than her, Eileen snapped, gesturing at both Vara and Kaleb. I formed the alliance between Caiaphas and the clans years ago. I worked to save lives when Roland burned Argenport. I lost men and women to retake the city from lawlessness and thieves. I have been... Been what? Kaleb shouted, throwing his hands wide. A general? I reckon you're right on that count. You've certainly killed more Crown Watch than anyone else here. Enough! Talir bellowed, slamming her staff into the ground. The earth rumbled and hot winds whirled around the mage as her eyes began to glow. The fate of your city and more is bound by few enough threads, and here you are, bickering. My brother would be ashamed. The hissing of the wind stopped, and Talir slumped, power fading from her eyes. She looked up at everyone and added, or amused. Eileen snorted and looked away. Talir continued, leaning on her staff. Your concerns are all valid, as are your strengths. She turned to Kaleb. You are so much like my brother, fiery, impulsive, charismatic. But you are also untested and quick to anger. Talir turned to Eileen, speaking over Caleb's objection. You are Caiaphas' wife, and Argenport's savior twice over. You are a compassionate commander, but you are set in your ways, and know little of the mysteries of the world. Eileen raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. And you, Talir turned to Vara, who crossed her arms, are undeniably Caiaphas' heir, all the more powerful for your experience with the Shadowlands and beyond. But you are slow to trust, and previously failed your duty to the throne, whatever your reasons. Turning to face her family, Talir gestured to herself. I have been here longer than any of you, and I suspect I will remain long after. This drew an uncomfortable look among the others, but Talir held up a finger, smiling. But I have no wish to rule. My curiosities are academic, not political, and besides, the premise is flawed. Pardon? Kaleb asked. There may be only one throne, Talir replied, but where is it written Argenport must have a single ruler? Let your strengths come together. Rule together. Talir gestured at each of them in turn. Eileen has the experience and bearing of a queen and loyalty of many in Argenport. Caleb's charm and martial skill can bolster that. Vara can lend her legitimacy to the throne and her experience in the Shadowlands to my studies. Argenport needs to look beyond its walls again, to diplomacy and threats abroad. No one of us can replace Caiaphas, but why should we? We can rule together. Talir held out a hand. Eileen glanced between Kaleb and Vara, shifting her stance and saying nothing. Vara took 3 long steps and took Talir's hand in a firm grasp. The world must be kept safe. I would learn more about the powers that lie beyond. I need the throne to do that, but it doesn't have to be mine alone. Talir smiled, and Vara felt someone place their hand on top of hers. Her mother stood next to her, head held high. I wish to protect my people, Eileen said, and build a dynasty of peace. I will accept all aid to that end. The 3 women turned to look at Kaleb. His scowl transformed slowly into a broad grin. This doesn't make a lick of sense to me, but I'd hate to be left out of the fun. I'm in, he said, placing his hand on top of Eileen's. Talir nodded. Very well. You 3 will rule as equals, each supporting the other. I will advise you all. Together, we will see what mysteries threaten our people and our home.